if you're like me, on occasion you get a splinter in your hand or you accidentally touch a thorny plant and get a thorn stuck, and then you might notice a few things happen. Well, if you're looking at your hand, you'll probably see that there's maybe some swelling. Maybe it starts to get red. Maybe it starts to warm up. What's going on there? Well, in this video, we're going to take a look at the immune system and your body's way of protecting against these foreign invaders that get into your body. Let's get started. So, why do we need an immune system? Well, the simple answer is your body is like a buffet for a lot of organisms, right? It's like going to the Golden Corral. You got a little bit of everything that they want. So we are attacked from the outside by pathogens who literally want you for lunch. They want all your really juicy body cells. And many of these pathogens need your tools, like viruses. They need all of your enzymes and your cellular components to make more viruses. So we get attacked from the outside from these pathogens, and then sometimes even our own body cells are abnormal, like cancer, and we can be attacked from the inside. So we need an immune system to fight off these attackers, whether external or internal. So I want to focus a little bit on these pathogens for a minute, all of these things that want you for lunch. So there's really several categories of pathogens: viruses, fungi, bacteria, protozoa, and parasites. Now let's specifically look at each one for a minute. Viruses, right? You know, big time, the big virus, SARS-CoV-2, what's causing COVID. HIV, chickenpox, herpes, these are all viruses. So these are just some genetic material wrapped around by a protein coat. Viruses definitely want you for lunch. Check. Fungi, do you think of fungi, mushrooms, etc.? Well, really, there are some funguses or fungi which want to eat you for lunch. Ringworm is a prime example. Is it a worm? Actually, no, it's actually fungal. But it maybe kind of looks like there's a worm there underneath your skin. So if you have something that looks like this, it could possibly be a ringworm infection. You might also have a yeast infection. Yeast like warmer, damp, moist areas. So you might get a yeast infection on your body as well. So fungi want you for lunch. Bacteria. We've had a podcast on this already, but bacteria definitely want to eat you for lunch. You've got a lot of good stuff for them to eat on. And this picture right here is a good example of the typical pattern from Lyme disease, the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. So TB, strep, staph infections, those are all bacteria. Bacteria want you for lunch. Protozoa, right? If you think of these sort of unicellular or multicellular protozoa, these are things, think of protists when we talked about those earlier. Things like malaria and giardia are caused from these protists or these protozoa, and you can see the giardia one there. These can cause some pretty nasty infections. And then even a little more advanced are some parasites. Roundworm is actually a worm. And here's a typical one, Caenorhabditis elegans, or C. elegans, we like to call it. And then you might have a tapeworm infection that's living in your digestive system. So all of these things essentially are pathogens that want to invade your body. So your body had to evolve an immune system to fight off all these foreign invaders. So how do different organisms protect themselves? We think a lot about humans and human immunology, but other organisms like plants and lesser non- or invertebrate animals also have to protect themselves. So how does that work? Well, we first want to divide and talk about two different types of immunity. There's innate immunity. Think of immunity that you're kind of born with naturally. And that's quick, but it's not very specific. So for example, if you have an infection, there's going to be some sensors in your body that recognize that pathogen and then activate cells, inflame your body, and then try to get rid of it. So notice this was what most organisms sort of have naturally. It's an innate immunity, quick and non-specific. A little more advanced immunity is one that's adaptive. It's longer term, so it's not quite as quick, but it is very specific. So for example, if you have an infection, you get a bacterial infection or a virus, your body will stimulate T and B cells, which are lymphocytes, and they will train other B and T cells to go to the infected site and remove the agent. And these are specific. So in this podcast, we're going to talk about the different lines of defense and innate and adaptive immunity. So now that we understand these sort of basic ideas of innate versus adaptive, let's see what different animals do. So invertebrates, maybe like a slug or a sea sponge, if you think about it, their immune system's pretty simple. Plants have their own immune system, believe it or not. And then vertebrates is a little more advanced, and especially mammals. So let's see what each of them does. Invertebrates, they're really the innate, right? That innate, quick, non-specific. So if something comes in, they're just going to fight off whatever is foreign or whatever is outside of the body. Plants, believe it or not, kind of have an immune system of their own. And this is a molecular recognition system that gives a systemic response. So let's say there's an infection here on this leaf there, right? Well, what's the plant to do, right? What it does is it will send chemical reaction to destroy that area and the nearby cells. So if this has got some bacterial or fungal infection, what the plant will do is it'll say, okay, we can sacrifice this leaf. It'll make it die so that that infection doesn't spread to the rest of the plant. So that's one way plants have an immune system. And then vertebrates, of course, you'd think is the most advanced. So all vertebrates generally have some pretty non-specific defense mechanisms. But when you get to higher levels like mammals, many of us have adaptive immunity when you're thinking like T cells and B cells. All right? So there's quite a range all the way from invertebrates to plants to vertebrate animals. We have different immune systems and different ways of fighting off foreign invaders. So our immune system has a complementary system, which we call the lymph system. So perhaps you've been to the doctor and the doctor feels up around your neck. And you're like, why are you feeling around my neck? Well, if you notice, around the neck, that's where part of the lymphatic system is. There's some lymph nodes here. And the reason they're feeling there is to see if it's inflamed or it's large, it's sort of grown. That could be the sign that you have an infection. So the lymph system, what it does is it produces and transports leukocytes, which is really just a fancy word for white blood cells. And we know that our white blood cells are involved in immunity, keeping you healthy. So the lymph system is the system throughout your body that transports and produces these white blood cells to fight things off. It also will help to trap foreign invaders that have come into your body. So let's look at some of these different organs in the lymph system. Lymph node, I've already mentioned. You see it's just a node right there where there'd be a lot of leukocyte buildup or white blood cell buildup. Then these nodes have pathways, and those are the lymph vessels. And these are really intertwined amongst the blood vessels, right? So they're like running right next to each other. They're intertwined, they commingle in and out together with the blood vessels. So we got the nodes for the lymph, we've got the vessels for the lymph. Then we have the thymus. This is an important part of the lymph and immune system too, because we'll see that this is where T cells mature. The spleen is also a very important organ. In fact, if you have some particular infections, if maybe you've heard of right? Mononucleosis, you could have an enlarged spleen because you've got so many monocytes that have gathered here in this area. Bone marrow is also another important part of the lymph system. Bone marrow is where your blood cells grow. So your red blood cells, your platelets, and your white blood cells, your leukocytes. We know red blood cells are for transporting oxygen. Platelets is involved in clotting. And white blood cells, we talked about in the immune system. So a lot of that starts all with these precursor stem cells that are in the bone marrow. We also have this area here, Peyer's patches. This is part of really kind of in that digestive system, and that's another place that we see a lot of lymph buildup as well. Okay, so you've got a lymph system, an immune system throughout your entire body. Okay, so let's talk about the lines of defense. There are really 1, 2, and I'm going to go through each of these, 3 different lines of defense. And what I want you to do is I want you to sort of think of it as a castle under attack. Your body, let's say it's a castle, and your body's under attack. So your body has evolved several different ways of fighting off. And we're specifically talking about mammals here, right, of which you are an example. So what's the first line of defense? Well, the first line of defense from outside invaders are the walls and the moats, the walls and the moats, the barriers, right? So if something's got to get into your body, it's got to get past your mucus, it's got to get past your skin. We call this broad external defense, right? This is why it's important that we keep our skin healthy. It's why important that we keep the mucus and we keep hydrated, because the skin and the mucous membranes, right, in our eyes and our nose and our mouth, that actually helps to fight off foreign invaders. So that's our sort of first line of attack. We need a strong wall, some skin. We need some moats, some mucus to trap out the foreign invaders. Okay, so let's say that something does sneak by, gets inside. Now it's inside your body. Well, then we're going to recruit the second line of defense. And I want you to think of this as sort of like broad, sort of general patrolling soldiers, okay? So they're walking throughout your body, right? Like these guys are moving throughout the city. And they see anything, they're probably going to attack and get rid of it. Now, notice it's kind of crude, right? They've just got a sword, right? They're not really super advanced, but anything they see, they can try to start to take down, and they might be able to alert others, okay? So think of the second line of defense as broad patrolling soldiers, and these are your white blood cells, which we think of as macrophages. If you remember back, macrophages are phagocytic, meaning they just sort of eat and engulf other things, okay? So they are phagocytic white blood cells. They're going to look for a foreign invader, attack it, eat it, engulf it, and get rid of it. Another second line of defense would be inflammation in your body. So back to our beginning picture of our hand. When we get inflammation, that's a body's way of sending in the troops to start to fight off any foreign pathogen. Okay, so we had some protection with the walls. We still got in. We had some patrolling soldiers. Maybe they missed the infection that caught in. Well, then we're going to go to our third line of defense, and that is what we call acquired specific immunity. I like to think of these as elite trained assassins, right? So notice this one's a little more advanced, right? It's got a little more technology, and it's really scoping out. It's looking for specific things. These snipers, they're really looking to kill specific pathogens in the body. They're not looking for the random people on the street. They're really looking and trained to go after one individual specific pathogen. In our body, these elite trained assassins are our lymphocytes and our antibodies, right? These are specific. They are specific to certain cells and to certain antigens, which we'll learn about later. Okay? So think, 3 lines of defense: barriers, patrolling soldiers, and then our elite trained assassins, the antibodies and lymphocytes that are going to fight things off for us. So let me go through each of these individually and give you a little more detail. First line of defense. That's our chemical barriers and our physical defenses. You think of the skin as a big one, right? And also our respiratory system has some barriers as well. In the trachea, right, there are all these cells which have a bunch of cilia, all these little hairs. So So the cilia has all, excuse me, the trachea has all these little cilia, these little hairs, and they will trap foreign invaders. And then there's also a bunch of mucus. Maybe you notice when you're sick, you kind of hack up a bunch of stuff. You've got a lot of mucus in your throat. Well, that's actually, that thick fluid is meant to trap some of those invaders that have come inside your body. So the respiratory system has its own sort of barrier and chemical defense. Your digestive system as well, right? Think of all the food that you eat. Some of that food probably has some bacteria, some chemical, or some viruses even, maybe some worms. And when you eat that, notice that the first thing that happens is saliva, right? That has some antibacterial properties to it. But also, we go right to the stomach then, right? And if you think of the stomach's got a lot of acid in it. That's going to start helping us defend against anything foreign by killing some of that stuff with that really low pH or that acidic nature. And then even your urogenital tract also has some defense mechanisms to keep foreign invaders out. Okay? So first line of defense is the skin, these mucus, and these barriers that we create, your body's created to fight off infection. Second line then, that's your broad patrolling soldiers, okay? This is a rapid response, and we've really got a few different types or a few different things involved in second line, okay? So the first one is leukocytes. That's our white blood cells. And these are phagocytic. So an example of this is the macrophage, and you can see it's eating maybe here some foreign invaders. You also have some neutrophils. These are involved, and you can see here they're looking around for foreign things too. It's going to engulf it. You also have dendritic cells. And these are white blood cells, but you'll notice here that they've got these little tentacles that are kind of like dendrites. If you remember us talking about the nervous system, all the dendrites on a neuron, they kind of look like that as well. So leukocytes are just these white blood cells that are phagocytic. They're going to engulf, they're going to eat anything they find. So it's sort of like killing things with a sword. It probably will get the job done, but it's not cute. We also have what's called a complement system. Think of it, it complements what's going on there. And they're basically these 30 proteins that are antimicrobial or anti-small viruses and bacteria. And what they do is these proteins, you can see several of them here, right? There's roughly 30 of them. What they'll do is they will activate, if they find a foreign invader, they'll activate a cascade which eventually will lead to either macrophage or eating it or lysis of that particular cell, okay? So the complement system is just a big group of proteins that are going around looking for foreign invaders as well. Then the third example, still in our second line of defense here, is inflammation. And inflammation is really this response that's localized, right? Think about our thorn in our skin earlier in our hand. And this inflammation is really going to signal some other things to happen. Okay, so I'm going to go over each of these in a little more detail on their own slide. So let's start with leukocytes. So here's how this would work. A leukocyte is phagocytic. It's just going to engulf a foreign body. All right, so here's let's say it's a macrophage. There's some foreign invaders out there. Well, the first thing it'll do is it'll sort of start to open up a little area here. Those things will be trapped. Then you'll notice that they start to come in a little more. Finally, it takes them in, puts them in a vesicle, and then it will more than likely fuse with a lysosome. And you may remember lysosomes will then break down any foreign particles. Okay, so that's an example of our sort of general patrolling soldiers. They're just going to eat and kill whatever looks foreign to the body. Here's a little more specific thing of what actually happens. So when you have a pathogen, the macrophage senses it, it recognizes it and says, oh, this is not good. So then you can see what happens is this thing comes in and the cell learns some information about it and then produces some different signaling proteins or molecules. These will then start different cascades and start different processes. So phagocytosis is very important to start the whole process. Inflammation is what takes us back to our very beginning slide. The inflammatory response is what happens when you get a thorn or some little splinter from wood. More than likely, when that came in your body and pierced your skin, it got past barrier 1. And notice all these pathogens, right? There's some bacteria that were on that thorn, and now guess what? They're in your body. The bacteria that was on the thorn or on the wood, it's now in your body. So the first part, step 1 of the inflammatory response, is the release of histamine, prostaglandins, and then some of these other signaling chemicals. Well, what does histamine do? Histamine actually causes the capillaries, right? This down here is your blood vessel, it's your capillary. It causes it to dilate or be more leaky, right? So things can leak out of it. What's going to leak out of your blood vessel? Oh, some of these white blood cells, these monocytes, these neutrophils, they can leak out into this wounded area and start to heal the tissue, okay? It's going to deliver the white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, clotting, right? These are things that are involved in clotting. We need to clot this skin, rebuild the skin so we get a scab. And this accounts for the redness and the swelling. So why is there redness? Why is there swelling? Why is there heat? Well, notice we've increased blood flow. Blood supply is going there. It's bringing a lot of needed things. So anytime we have increased blood flow, we're going to have increased swelling, increased redness, and heat as well. Okay, so that's what the histamine does. Opens up this, lets these white blood cells come in. Prostaglandins are involved in pain. This is the chemical that goes to your brain and says, hey, don't do what you just did. And to teach you a lesson, sort of, you're going to feel some pain, right? So the pain we feel is actually from the release of prostaglandins there as well. Okay, so we've had our thorn enter. Histamine's released. Now these white blood cells have been able to leak out of the blood supply. We're going to start to heal the tissue with our clotting factors. We're going to get these white blood cells to eat all our pathogens, right? And then what's going to happen? Well, we need to get rid of the pathogen, okay? Get rid of those bacteria that may have found their way in and make a nice scar to continue. So this inflammatory response, while it may not be fun, is actually an important part of our immune system. Okay, the third line of defense. The third line is the most specific, and in fact, I have an entire video on this. It's our next video that you can watch about cellular immunology. It gets very detailed, but I just want to give you a little glance before we wrap up this video. So the third line of defense is specific, and that involves your lymphocytes, right? Think about your lymph system. That's what's in your lymph system, all these lymphocytes. So there are two types we're going to talk about, the B cells and the T cells. The other important specific thing in your third line of defense is antibodies, right? So you got lymphocytes, you got antibodies. These are specific. What do antibodies do? They bind to an antigen. Well, you may say, what's an antigen? Well, an antigen is on a specific pathogen, a specific toxin, or even some of your own body cells, which are cancerous. So in the next podcast or in the next video, we're going to talk quite a bit about antigens, right? Which are just, if you think about it, if you've got a pathogen, right? I'm a bad bacteria here, okay? Mean. On this pathogen, there's this little antigen, which is sort of like a name tag. Okay, so we're going to learn a lot about this in our next video. But let me just give you a brief overview of this third line of defense. So if a pathogen gets in, you're going to have some alerting cells, some basic macrophages, some dendritic cells that are going to alert. From there, that activation, right, we're going to cause some inflammation. Now look what's going on. Oh, I've got a foreign pathogen, it says. I better alert and take you over to the lymph node and let the other troops know, right? So once we get to these lymph nodes here, you can see we're going to produce a few more cells. Notice we'll get a B cell, we'll get some T cells activated. This one right here is called the helper T cell, which alerts the other T cells and the B cells. And finally, this last line of defense will be that the plasma B cells are going to make antibodies. And then we're going to have some killer T cells, which are going to go and fight the infection. So if this seems really complicated to you, that's because it is. This third line of defense, I think, is the most complicated, which is why I've devoted an entire video to it. I'm going to run through this slide one more time so that you're in a better position to look at the next video. But as we try to wrap it up, don't worry, because I'm going to go into much more detail on this in a moment in the next video. So, third line of defense, last time, let me just run through this, is that we've got these lymphocytes produced and antibodies produced. So, back here, this is our second line of defense. This macrophage sees the pathogen, goes on a journey to alert the immune system, the lymph system. When it gets there, it alerts the helper T cells, which say, all right, B cells, T cells, activate. And then I'm going to need you, plasma B cells, to create some antibodies, and you, T cells, to go and kill some of these other infected cells or pathogens as well. Okay? So, there are 3 lines of defense. Defense 1, barriers, mucus. Defense 2, patrolling soldiers, like your macrophages. Defense 3, third line, specific active immunity, which is really going to finish off that invading pathogen. So hopefully this was a good introduction to the immune system to you. For more details, make sure you watch the next video on cellular immunology.